In the year 1849, a Frenchman nearly 60 years old stood at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia and agreed to do something that no one in America had ever done. He would bore a railroad tunnel more than 4,200 feet straight through the heart of a mountain of solid rock, by hand, with no machine of any kind, at a time before dynamite had even been invented. When it was finished, it would be the longest railroad tunnel in the United States. His name was Claudius Crozet, and before he ever saw that mountain, he had been an artillery officer in the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. This is the story of the tunnel he drove through the Blue Ridge, of the 800 Irishmen and the 40 enslaved men who dug it, of the many who died doing it, and of why, more than a century and a half later, you can walk straight through that mountain yourself. Begin with Crozet, because the man is almost as remarkable as the tunnel. He was born in France in the last year of the 1700s and trained as an artillery officer and a military engineer, and he served under Napoleon himself. He marched into Russia with the Grand Army in 1812 in that catastrophic invasion, and at the great and terrible Battle of Borodino, he was taken prisoner by the Russians. He survived his captivity, was released, and returned to the French army. And then, when Napoleon fell for the last time and the empire collapsed, Crozet did what a great many talented men of a defeated cause have done. He left the old world for the new. He emigrated to the United States in 1816, and he brought with him something America badly needed. Crozet was one of the finest mathematical and engineering minds of his age, trained in the rigorous French schools that were then the best in the world. He was hired to teach at the United States Military Academy at West Point, and there he introduced a level of advanced mathematics and engineering that the young academy had never seen, teaching the men who would go on to build much of the country and to fight its Civil War. He helped found the Virginia Military Institute. He surveyed and mapped the wild interior of Virginia so thoroughly that men called him the pathfinder of the Blue Ridge. And so, when Virginia at last resolved to push a railroad west across the mountains, there was really only one man to put in charge of it. It is worth understanding just how large a figure Crozet was, because it tells you how seriously Virginia took this mountain. At West Point, he had all but rebuilt the teaching of engineering, bringing the rigorous descriptive geometry of the French schools to a young academy that badly needed it, and writing textbooks that shaped a whole generation of American engineers and soldiers. The officers who would go on to build the railroads and the bridges of the growing country and to command the armies of both sides in the Civil War had many of them learned their mathematics from this quiet, exacting Frenchman. He was not a man who guessed. He was a man who calculated, who measured, who checked his figures and then checked them once again. And that habit of mind was about to be tested against a mountain in a way that hand-waving and hope could never survive. When Virginia needed someone who could aim a tunnel through solid rock and be right, Crozet was the obvious, and perhaps the only, choice. Understand why Virginia was so desperate to cross those mountains, because it is the same story that drove so much of the building of this country. To the north, New York had its canal and its railroads, carrying the trade of the West to the sea. Virginia, proud old Virginia, was being left behind, cut off from the growing Ohio Valley by the long wall of the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies beyond it. If Virginia could not get a railroad over the mountains, its ports would wither and its rivals would take the future. So in 1849, the state chartered the Blue Ridge Railroad, and it named Claudius Crozet its chief engineer, and it asked him to do the impossible thing that everyone else had said could not be done. Virginia had tried other ways to reach the West, and had watched them fall short. It had built a great canal up the James River, hoping to float the trade of the Ohio Valley down to the sea at Richmond. But a canal cannot climb a mountain, and the Blue Ridge stopped it as surely as it stopped everything else. Meanwhile, just to the north, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was driving hard for the West and threatening to capture the very commerce that Virginia meant to have for itself. Pride was in it too. This was the Virginia of the Founding Fathers, the state that thought of itself as first among the states, and it did not intend to sit and become a quiet backwater while upstart cities to the north grew rich on the trade of a continent. The railroad across the Blue Ridge was Virginia's answer, its bid to stay in the front rank of the nation. and every bit of it depended, in the end, on getting a train through that one mountain. The Blue Ridge at the place called Rockfish Gap is a hard, high barrier, and Crozet's solution was bold. He would carry the railroad across it with a series of 4 tunnels bored through the ridge, and the westernmost, and by far the greatest of them, would pierce the very crest of the mountain. That great tunnel, the Blue Ridge Tunnel, would run more than 4,200 feet through the rock. The exact figure is given a little differently in different records, some saying 4,273 feet, and some a little less, and we will be honest about that small uncertainty. But by any measure it was, when it was finished, the longest railroad tunnel in the United States, and one of the longest in the world. To picture the task, picture the place. Rockfish Gap is a saddle in the long north to south wall of the Blue Ridge, one of the lower crossings, and even there, the mountain rises steep and stubborn. Crozet's line did not simply punch one hole and stop. To thread the railroad through that broken country, he had to drive 4 separate tunnels through the rock in the space of a few miles, each one boring through a shoulder or a spur of the ridge, with deep cuts and high fills and bridges strung between them. 3 of the 4 were shorter. The 4th, the westernmost, went straight through the main crest of the mountain, and it was the monster, more than 4,200 feet of solid rock, the one that would make or break the whole railroad and the reputation of the man who built it. When people speak today of the Blue Ridge Tunnel, it is that great western bore, the one many still call the Crozet Tunnel, that they mean. Now hold in your mind what that actually meant to build in the 1850s, because this is the heart of it. There were no tunnel boring machines. There were no pneumatic drills. There was no dynamite. It would not be invented for nearly another decade. There was only rock, and there were only men with hand tools and black powder. To advance the tunnel, a man would hold a long steel drill against the rock face, while others swung heavy sledgehammers to strike it, turning the drill a little after each blow, hammering a hole into the solid stone by main force. It was called hand drilling, and it was as slow and as brutal as it sounds. Into each finished hole they packed black powder, the old weak gunpowder, tamped it, ran a fuse, and blasted a little more of the mountain loose. Then men and boys shoveled the shattered rock into carts by hand and hauled it out, and the whole grinding cycle began again. Some days, through the hardest rock, the 2 faces of the tunnel advanced only a few inches. Every part of that drilling was done by the strength and the skill of men, in a rhythm as old as mining itself. One man, the shaker, crouched and held the long steel drill against the rock and gave it a small turn between every blow, while 1 or 2 others swung heavy, long-handled sledgehammers down onto the head of the steel, again and again, hour upon hour, the man holding the drill, trusting the men with the hammers not to miss, and the men with the hammers trusting him not to flinch. When a drill went dull, and in that hard green stone the drills went dull constantly, it was carried out to a blacksmith, who reforged and sharpened the steel in a glowing forge, so that a whole small army of smiths worked day and night just to keep the drills biting into the mountain. And after every round of blasting, the broken rock, tons upon tons of it, had to be shoveled by hand into carts and hauled out of the tunnel before the next round could even begin. There was no part of it that a machine ever touched. It was muscle and skill and nerve all the way down. And they drove it from both ends at once. On the eastern side and on the western side, separate crews began boring into the mountain toward each other, aiming to meet somewhere deep in the middle, thousands of feet in and hundreds of feet below the crest, working for years toward a point they could not see. Inside, the conditions were a vision of a particular kind of hell. The only light was candle and oil lamp. There was no ventilation to speak of, so the smoke of the black powder and the smoke of the lamps and the dust of the drilling hung in the dead air, and the men breathed it shift after shift. Water seeped and dripped and sometimes flooded. The rock was hard green stone that dulled the drills and broke the hammers, and it fell without warning. Into that darkness, day after day, year after year, went the men who built this tunnel. Try, for a moment, to be there. You are 1,000 feet or more inside a mountain, in a space lit only by the small flames of candles and oil lamps wedged into the rock, flames that gutter and dim as the air goes bad. The air is thick, And it is getting worse. Full of the sharp smoke of the black powder that will not clear because there is nowhere for it to go, and full of the fine rock dust that you breathe into your lungs, shift after shift, the dust that would kill some of these men slowly, years later, long after they had left the tunnel behind. Water drips from the ceiling and runs cold down your neck and pools around your boots, and sometimes it comes not as a drip, but as a flood that must be bailed and pumped. And above you and all around you hangs the sheer weight of the whole mountain, held back by nothing at all but the strength of the rock itself and the judgment of the men who decide where it is safe to keep digging. That was the workplace. That was every single day, for years, for the men who bored the Blue Ridge. If you value the memory of the immigrant and the enslaved workers who dug through the mountains of this country by hand and were paid little and thanked less, then subscribe to Global Old History, because saying their names is the whole reason this channel exists. Most of those men were Irish. Crozet's railroad recruited its labor from among the Irish immigrants who were, in exactly those years, pouring into America by the hundreds of thousands, driven out of Ireland by the great famine that was starving their country. They came to the Blue Ridge with nothing, and they took the most dangerous work in America, drilling and blasting inside a mountain, and they lived in rough shanty camps on the mountainside with their wives and their children. About 800 Irish men worked on the Blue Ridge Tunnel and the line around it, and they lived and died on that mountain with their families beside them. But the Irish were not the only ones who dug this mountain, and here we have to be careful and honest, because the two groups of workers were not the same and must not be blurred together. Alongside the 800 Irishmen worked about 40 enslaved African American men, and their situation was different in every way. They were not paid for their labor. They were hired out to the railroad by the men who legally owned them, who collected the wages for the work these men were forced to do. They were housed separately from the Irish, apart from the shanty camps. They had no freedom to leave the work, and no share in whatever it earned. 40 men, enslaved, drilling and blasting and hauling rock inside a mountain for the profit of others. They belong in this story by name and by number, distinct and not folded into the rest, because their bondage was part of the price of this tunnel, just as surely as the Irish blood was. The system that put those 40 men in the tunnel is worth naming plainly, because it was ordinary, and legal and monstrous all at once. In the slave states, a man who owned human beings could rent them out by the year to whoever needed labor, and the wages the rented man earned went not to him, but to the man who owned him. It was called hiring out, and it was a common way for slaveholders to turn the people they owned into a steady stream of income. So the enslaved men on the Blue Ridge were, in the eyes of the law and of their owners, a rented asset, sent to do the most dangerous work in America so that other men could pocket their pay. They drilled the same rock and breathed the same poisoned air as the Irish beside them. And then they went at night not to their own families and their own hearth, but to separate quarters, under watch, with nothing of their own to show for the mountain they were helping to move. And then, in 1854, death came to the mountain in a form worse than any rockfall. Cholera broke out. Cholera is a savage disease, spread through fouled water, and it can kill a healthy person in a matter of hours. And in the crowded, filthy conditions of the shanty camps, it ran through the Irish like fire. Men who had gone into the tunnel healthy in the morning were dead by nightfall. It killed the workers, and because their families lived with them on the mountain, it killed their wives and their children too. About 33 Irish men, women, and children living in the shanties near the tunnel are recorded to have died in that single epidemic, and the true number was very likely higher, because the deaths of poor immigrants in a mountain camp were not carefully counted. To understand the terror of it, you have to understand the disease. Cholera strikes without warning and works with horrifying speed. A man well at breakfast could be seized by the afternoon and dead by the next morning, racked and wrung out by it. And there was, in that age, no cure and barely any understanding of how it spread. In the crowded shanty towns clinging to the mountainside, with their fouled water and their close quarters, the disease found perfect ground. Whole families were struck down together. The dead had to be buried quickly, in haste and in fear, in rough graves near the camps. And those who could, fled. scattering off the mountain to escape the invisible killer, so that for a time the work itself faltered as the labor force died or ran. It is one thing to read the number of the dead. It is another to imagine the scene, a mountain work site turned into a place of plague, the drilling gone silent, the graves multiplying on the slopes, and the tunnel waiting, unfinished, in the dark. And here the difference between the two groups of workers shows itself in the starkest possible way. The enslaved men, by and large, did not catch the cholera. In part, this was because they were housed separately, away from the worst of the contagion. But there was another reason, and it is a cold one. The men who owned the enslaved workers, hearing that a deadly epidemic was sweeping the camps, pulled their enslaved men away from the tunnel and out of danger. Not out of mercy, but because an enslaved man was, to them, valuable property, a financial investment they did not wish to lose to disease. The Irish, who were free men, were left to face the cholera. The enslaved, who were not free at all, were withdrawn precisely because their owners had money at stake in keeping them alive. There is no crueler illustration of what slavery did to the value of a human life. It should be said, too, that the enslaved men did die on this railroad in other ways. At least 3 of them killed in runaway rail car and handcar accidents on the line, and they are remembered here as well. Now, about the total death toll, we are going to be precise, because this audience deserves precision, and because a number carelessly thrown around does the dead no honor. The most commonly cited figure is that at least 189 people are recorded to have died during the construction of the Blue Ridge Railroad. But you must understand exactly what that number is and is not. It is a count for the whole railroad project, the Great Tunnel and the 3 smaller ones, and the line between them, not for the big tunnel alone. It includes men, women, and children. And it is dominated not by dramatic tunnel cave-ins, but by disease, above all by that cholera epidemic of 1854. And it is, almost certainly, an undercount, a floor, and not a ceiling, because the record-keeping of the age simply did not trouble to track every immigrant laborer or enslaved man who died on a mountain in Virginia. So when you hear that the Blue Ridge Tunnel cost nearly 200 lives, know that the truth is at least that many, recorded, and very probably more, that were never written down at all. Consider one more thing that Crozet had to solve while all this went on, because it shows the mind of the man. The tunnel would take years, and Virginia could not wait years for its railroad to open. So Crozet did something audacious. While the great bore crept forward inside the mountain, he laid a temporary track up and over the top of the Blue Ridge, a steep and twisting line that climbed the outside of the mountain the tunnel was piercing, so that trains could actually cross the ridge and the railroad could open for business years before the tunnel beneath was done. For a time, trains labored up and over the mountain on one of the steepest railroad grades in the country, while below them, in the dark, the Irish and the enslaved drilled steadily toward the day the trains could go straight through instead of over. That temporary line over the top of the mountain was no small thing in its own right. To climb the outside of a ridge that the tunnel would soon pierce, it had to be laid at grades and around curves so severe that it counted among the steepest and sharpest railroad tracks in the entire country, a line that ordinary locomotives could barely manage at all. Trains crawled up one side and eased down the other with the greatest of care. It was meant to last only a few years until the tunnel opened beneath it, and yet for those years it carried the whole traffic of the railroad up and over the very rock that hundreds of men were laboring to dig through below. 2 railroads, in effect, existed at once on the same mountain, one temporary line straining over the top in the daylight, and one permanent bore creeping through the heart of the stone in the dark. And the same careful Frenchman had planned them both. And after years of that labor, the 2 crews, boring from opposite ends, met in the darkness, deep inside the mountain. This is the moment that should make an engineer's heart stop, because it is where all of Crozet's mathematics was put to the final test. 2 tunnels, driven for years from opposite sides of a mountain, through solid rock, guided by nothing but hand surveying and the calculations of the man in charge, had to meet. And they met, deep in the Blue Ridge, with only the slightest error, the 2 bores lining up so nearly true that it stands as one of the great feats of surveying in American history. The Frenchman who had learned his mathematics in the schools of Napoleon had aimed a tunnel through a mountain from both ends and hit his mark in the dark. Think hard about what that demanded. To make two tunnels meet inside a mountain, you must know, with extraordinary exactness, the direction and the slope and the length of each bore, and you must carry that knowledge from the open air, over the top of the mountain, down into the darkness of each heading, and hold it perfectly true through years of digging, as each line creeps hundreds and then thousands of feet into the rock. A tiny error of angle at the mouth becomes, far inside the mountain, a miss of many feet, the two tunnels sliding silently past one another in the stone, never to meet. Crozet's men carried his careful lines and his levels into the dark and kept them faithful, and when the last wall of rock between the two headings was blasted away, the openings matched almost perfectly. In an age of hand instruments and candlelight, with no way on earth to see through solid stone, that was very nearly a miracle. And it was the direct fruit of a lifetime spent as Crozet had spent his, refusing ever to guess. The Blue Ridge Tunnel opened to trains on the 13th of April, 1858. It had taken the better part of a decade. It was, on that day, the longest railroad tunnel in the United States, a hole more than 4,200 feet long, driven through the solid crest of a mountain entirely by the muscle of men, with hand drills and black powder. In an age before a single one of the machines we would now think the job demanded. Claudius Crozet lived to see it open, an old man by then, and he died a few years later. In 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, that so many of his West Point students were fighting on both sides. There is a deep poignancy in that. Crozet had spent his life training the engineers and the officers of a united country, and had bent all his genius toward binding Virginia to the rest of the nation with a road of iron through the mountains, and he died just as that nation was tearing itself apart, with his own former students commanding the guns on both sides of the line. The tunnel he had built to carry the peaceful commerce of a growing country would spend the war years carrying soldiers and supplies instead. But it endured, as he had built it to endure, and his name endured along with it. The little town that grew up near his great work is called Crozet to this day, and the tunnel itself is still called the Crozet Tunnel by many who walk it, so that the soldier of Napoleon who aimed a bore clean through a Virginia mountain is remembered, still, in the very place he pierced. For most of a century the tunnel did its work, carrying the trains of Virginia through the mountain, until the demands of another age outgrew it. In 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, when heavier and larger trains were needed to move the material of the war, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway bored a new, larger tunnel right alongside the old one and switched the trains onto it. That newer tunnel is still in use today, and Crozet's Great Tunnel, the longest in America in its day, fell silent. Its ends were closed, and for 76 years it sat dark and abandoned inside the mountain, slowly filling with water and rockfall, remembered by almost no one but a few local historians and the ghosts of the men who had died to dig it. But it was not lost, and that is the last and best turn of the story. After a long campaign and a decade of careful, difficult restoration work, pumping out the water, shoring up the rock, clearing the debris, and building trails to reach it, the Blue Ridge Tunnel was reopened, late in the year 2020, this time not to trains but to people, on foot. It is now the centerpiece of a public trail more than 2 miles long, and the tunnel itself, all 4,200 feet and more of it, is open for anyone to walk straight through, from one side of the mountain to the other. Getting it to that point was its own long labor of love, carried out by people who refused to let the tunnel be forgotten. For decades, the abandoned bore had been a dangerous, flooded, half-collapsed ruin, sealed off and slowly returning to the mountain. Bringing it back meant years of patient and difficult work, pumping out the standing water, clearing the rock falls and the debris, stabilizing the rock overhead, and cutting new trails up to the old portals through the Virginia woods. It was expensive, and it was slow, and it was driven in large part by local people and a dedicated foundation who simply believed that what the Irish and the enslaved had built with their hands was worth saving and worth showing. And when it finally opened, it did what only a handful of historic places can ever do. It let ordinary people put themselves, physically, bodily, inside the labor of the past. And that is why this story matters so much to this channel, because you can do more than read about it. You can go and walk into the mountain. You can pass through the same bore that the Irish and the enslaved drilled by hand, and put your own hand on the rock, and see, still there in the stone, the marks left by the hand drills, the drill holes that the men bored one hammer blow at a time before dynamite existed to do it for them. You can feel the cold and the dark and the drip of the water, and know that for years men breathed the powder smoke here, and that some of them died here, and that their families died in the camps on the slopes outside. There are graves near the tunnel, the graves of the cholera dead, Irish men and women and children who came across an ocean to escape a famine and found their end inside a Virginia mountain. Stand in the middle of that bore, halfway through the mountain, where the light from both ends has shrunk to a distant gray coin, and the dark presses close around you. And it is very hard not to feel them there. The men who spent their lives in this exact darkness, drilling toward a light they could not yet see. The mountain has not changed. The rock is the same rock. The only real difference is that you can walk out the far side in a few minutes, and they could not for years. That is the gift this tunnel gives, the thing that no book and no photograph ever can. It puts your own body in the place their bodies were, and it lets the mountain itself tell you, in the cold and the dark and the dripping silence, exactly what it asked of them. So remember them, all of them, when you hear this story. Remember Claudius Crozet, the soldier of Napoleon who became the pathfinder of the Blue Ridge and aimed a tunnel through a mountain from both ends and met himself in the dark. Remember the 800 Irish free men and women who took the most dangerous work in America and were left to face the cholera. Remember the 40 enslaved men, hired out for another man's profit, withdrawn from the plague only because they were worth money. And remember that at least 3 of them died anyway. Remember that the true number of the dead is at least 189 recorded, and surely more. And remember that they cut a hole more than 4,000 feet through the heart of a mountain with their hands, and that it is still there, and that you can walk through it. If that is the kind of true story you want to keep hearing, about the ordinary people who built this country with their hands and their lives, then subscribe to Global Old History, and we will keep going to stand where they stood, one forgotten place at a time.